Night is falling over the desert. The sand is still hot underfoot after a day of brutal heat, but the sky above Saudi Arabia is starting to fill with thousands of stars. It's the same landscape Bedouins have watched for centuries as they led their caravans across the dunes, and it's exactly here, in a place that seems eternally unchanged, that a project is being born which aims to change the course of history. For decades, Saudi Arabia was a synonym for oil. The smell of gasoline, tankers leaving the ports, giant refineries glowing at night like cities of fire. Oil turned Bedouins into billionaires, paid for palaces, private jets, gold watches, and influence at the UN. But the same black gold also became a trap. Every crisis, every price swing on global markets reminded the kingdom that the entire system rested on a single fragile pillar. Then a new vision appeared. Mohammed bin Salman, crown prince, young, ambitious, impatient, said out loud what others had only whispered: oil is finite. We have to find something more. That's how the Vision 2030 plan was born, and its loudest symbol became the city of NEOM. Imagine this: a straight line stretching 170 kilometers across the desert, with millions of people living inside it. A floating industrial city the size of Amsterdam drifting on the Red Sea. A mountain ski resort where snow falls in the middle of the desert. Luxury islands meant to attract tourists from Europe and Asia. These are not scenes from a science fiction movie. These are plans already taking shape on the desks of top architects and in the servers of global corporations. NEOM is not just an investment. It is the advertising poster of a new Saudi Arabia, a country that, until yesterday, was associated with desert and oil, now saying, "We want to be the future." But NEOM is not only about buildings, it is also about people. Women who just a few years ago were not allowed to drive are now being hired by tech companies. Young Saudis raised in the shadow of mosques and prohibitions now go to concerts and watch films in cinemas, because the cinema ban was only lifted in 2018. Families that never considered tourism as a business are now investing in hotels, restaurants, and entertainment centers. NEOM is meant to be the culmination of this shift, an experiment testing whether Saudi Arabia can move beyond its own past. And for business, it's an invitation. The kingdom is saying, "Help us build the future and we will pay." For an engineer, it's the contract of a lifetime. For an architect, a canvas no one has ever had. For a startup, a market where you can be the first and write yourself into history. For a consultant, a laboratory where every solution can become a model for the world. That is what sets NEOM apart from much of the rest of the globe. In Europe, markets are saturated. In the US, competition is brutal. In parts of Asia, regulations are rigid. Here you get a blank page and a budget counted in hundreds of billions. How did the story of NEOM begin? Imagine you're standing now on that desert. Around you, there is only silence, sand, and rock. No lights, no roads. And suddenly, in your mind, you hear the hum of futuristic trains, the footsteps of millions of people, the sound of concerts, conversations in hundreds of languages. 10 years from now, this place could look completely different. That is NEOM. Not just a city. Not just an investment. It is a laboratory of the future, a test of whether humans can win a battle against the desert and against their own limitations. And this is where our second journey begins. From oil, which for decades defined Saudi Arabia, to a vision that is meant to define its future. For most of its modern existence, Saudi Arabia has been a state defined by a single resource. Oil became its blessing, its curse, and above all, its identity. In a land where life for centuries revolved around oases, caravans, and Bedouins crossing the sands, the discovery of oil in 1938 in Dammam changed everything. It didn't just open a door to the global economy, it literally created a new Saudi Arabia. Within a few decades, desert camps turned into cities with skyscrapers, camels gave way to fleets of luxury cars, and state revenues began to exceed the annual budgets of entire regions of the world. Oil became the foundation of a welfare state. It paid for free education and healthcare, subsidies for energy and fuel, housing for young couples, and a guarantee of public sector jobs. For years, every citizen felt that the state was paying them for loyalty, and loyalty was the most important capital for a monarchy that had to keep the balance between tribes, powerful clergy, and a fast-growing young population. Oil gave a sense of security, but it also made the entire economy a gambler addicted to a single table. Every oil crisis exposed that vulnerability. In the 1980s, a sudden price drop forced the government to cut spending and roll back some benefits. In 2014, the situation was even more dramatic. The price per barrel fell from $110 to around $30, and budget revenues were cut in half. A kingdom that had grown used to easy billions suddenly watched the red line crashing down its charts in Riyadh and felt that the foundations of its power were shaking. People started talking more openly that oil would not last forever. But in a country where every crisis had so far been just a temporary inconvenience, no one had the courage to say it out loud. Mohammed bin Salman did. In 2016, the Crown Prince, only about 30 at the time, already understood that unless he triggered a revolution, his generation would witness the kingdom's decline. In April that year, at a conference in Riyadh broadcast worldwide, 2 words appeared on the screens: Vision 2030. The room fell silent, and the prince said a sentence that became a turning point in Saudi history. "Our dependence on oil threatens our future. If we don't reform today, tomorrow will be too late." Vision 2030 was more than an economic strategy. It was a roadmap, a political manifesto, and a social promise. For the first time, the leadership said openly that oil would not be enough, and outlined 3 pillars of a new Saudi Arabia: a more open and dynamic society, a diversified economy, and a modern state that functions more efficiently and with less bureaucracy. Change was supposed to touch everything, from education and the labor market to women's rights and the way the country presented itself to the world. Reforms that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier suddenly started to happen. Women got the right to drive. Cinemas reopened after 35 years of prohibition. Riyadh began to host concerts and festivals. The state poured billions into sports, from Formula One to signing global football stars into the local league. All of this was meant to send one clear message: we are different. We are changing. We want to be part of the global game. Vision 2030 also had a hard economic edge. Saudi Arabia set up sovereign funds worth hundreds of billions, simplified visa rules, created special economic zones, and actively started inviting foreign firms to collaborate. The kingdom understood it could not build a new economy alone, and that it needed partners from across the globe: engineers, architects, tech experts, fintech, and biotech companies. For society, Vision 2030 was a shock. Older generations who had grown up under the umbrella of free benefits suddenly had to accept taxes and cuts to subsidies. Younger Saudis saw opportunity. For women, it meant doors opening to education and the labor market. For men, it meant the chance to try their hand in startups, tourism, culture. Vision 2030 became a generational fault line. For older people, it was the loss of comforts. For the young, a promise of a different future. For the first time in its history, Saudi Arabia looked in the mirror and said, "Oil cannot be the end of our story. It has to be the beginning of something new." And to convince the world that this wasn't just rhetoric, the prince showcased NEOM, a city of the future that was meant to become the symbol of a new era. NEOM as the face of transformation. When Mohammed bin Salman unveiled Vision 2030 in April 2016, his team knew they needed more than an economic plan and a list of reforms. They needed an image that would grab imagination. Documents, tables, and charts carry weight in ministries, but they don't stir emotions in the public or in foreign investors. They needed a symbol, a flagship, a project so huge it could not be ignored. That's how the idea of NEOM was born. A city of the future designed as the embodiment of the entire transformation. From the beginning, NEOM was crafted as a promotional project, in the positive sense of that word. It was supposed to be a poster hanging over the world announcing, "Look, the Saudis are no longer a closed, austere, oil-dependent country. We design the future." The renderings presented to the public looked like stills from a sci-fi film. Kilometer-long glass walls cutting across the desert, futuristic pods gliding above the ground, green gardens hidden inside rocky canyons, skiers going down slopes in a place where summer temperatures reach 45 degrees in the shade. The world reacted exactly as the prince had hoped. Media printed the visuals, experts argued about whether any of it was feasible, and consulting and engineering firms queued up for a piece of the project. NEOM's imagery spread across the globe, and Saudi Arabia started appearing in headlines not as a land of oil and religious severity, but as a country trying to build the most futuristic city on Earth. But NEOM is not just marketing. It's also a political and economic tool. The Saudi leadership knew that you can't mobilize society with tax reform and subsidy cuts alone. They needed something that would spark imagination, give young people the sense that dreaming is worth it, and that their future does not have to be a copy of their fathers' and grandfathers' careers in refineries. NEOM was supposed to be that promise, a place where Saudis could see that they can create advanced technologies, develop tourism, design cities, and work in sectors that, until now, existed only in the West. It's no coincidence that every component of NEOM was wrapped in a narrative highlighting innovation and global reach. The line, a narrow city stretching 170 kilometers, was meant to symbolize ecology, zero emissions, no cars, and clean air. Oxagon, a gigantic floating industrial hub, was intended as proof that Saudi Arabia could lead in advanced manufacturing and logistics. Trojena, the mountain ski resort, was designed to show that a desert can transform into a winter playground, attracting tourists from Europe and Asia. Sindala, the luxury island, was meant to become a magnet for the global rich and famous, who would spend their holidays there, and in doing so, promote the kingdom's new image. Each of these projects operates on several levels at once. First, as a real investment that should create jobs and new sources of revenue. Second, as a political gesture demonstrating the prince's determination to reform. Third, as a PR tool landing on front pages and in investor decks. And fourth, as a promise to Saudis themselves that the country they live in is genuinely changing. From day one, NEOM also sparked questions and controversy. Critics called it a mirage, too big to be built, a project doomed to the same fate as Masdar City in Abu Dhabi. Others pointed out that even if the skyscrapers rise, it will be far harder to build a community that truly wants to live there. Others still reminded the world that behind the glossy visuals there is a human cost. People displaced from desert villages who had no say in the decision that their land would become part of the city of the future. But despite all these voices, one thing is clear. NEOM became the face of Vision 2030. It's what the global press wrote about, what investment conferences highlighted, what young Saudis watched on TikTok and Instagram. Oil brought money, and NEOM brought dreams. And that is exactly what Mohammed bin Salman needed. A symbol that would turn attention away from the old Saudi Arabia and direct it towards a new one full of light, glass, and steel. Because in politics and economics, the winner isn't always the one with the strongest foundations. Sometimes it's the one who can sell the strongest vision. And NEOM, whether it is completed in full or only in part, has already completed its first mission. It made the world talk about Saudi Arabia not just as a kingdom of barrels, but as a country that wants to build tomorrow. But before the first plans for NEOM City could emerge, the price of oil had to fall. The year 2014 is etched into Saudi history as a moment when the desert reminded the kingdom of its harshness. On the surface, nothing had changed. The sand was just as hot. Evening prayers still echoed from the minarets. Tankers still left ports on the Red Sea and the Gulf. But the numbers on trading screens and laptops in Riyadh were merciless. The price of a barrel dropped from over $110 to barely $30. Within months, state revenue had been cut in half. In the cool, air-conditioned offices of the finance and energy ministries, the atmosphere grew heavy. Tables filled with reports that would have seemed absurd just a few years earlier. Warnings about the need for cuts, about budget deficits, about unavoidable reductions in subsidies. For a state that had spent decades accustoming its citizens to free healthcare, cheap fuel, and free education, that prospect bordered on political suicide. Picture a crisis meeting in one of Riyadh's palaces. The room is cool from the AC but hot with tension. On the wall, a chart with a red line plunging sharply down. Ministers, advisors, princes, all staring at the numbers. One advisor says bluntly, "If this continues, we won't be able to pay civil servants. We won't be able to finance projects. Our system is like a building on a single column. If the column cracks, everything collapses." The image had a symbolic dimension. The richest country in the region discovered that its power rested on something as fragile as the global price of a commodity it did not control. U.S. shale producers pumped more. China reduced demand, and suddenly the Saudi budget looked like a leaking barrel. For ordinary citizens, the shock was just as painful. For the first time in years, the state began to trim benefits, introduce taxes, and raise the prices of basic services. People who had lived all their lives assuming that oil meant a free life were forced to see that reality might look different. For older generations, it felt like a betrayal of an unwritten social contract. We give loyalty to the rulers, and they give us security and comfort. For the young, it was a signal that the existing model would not survive another few decades. The world was watching too. Analysts in London and New York said openly, if Saudi Arabia doesn't diversify its economy, its budget will not withstand future price swings. Terms like resource curse, oil trap, and rentier state entered reports on the kingdom. And that was the moment Mohammed bin Salman stepped onto the stage. Young, ambitious, uncompromising. He understood his generation could not afford the luxury of waiting. He knew that if he failed to offer something new, the dynasty's authority would erode and the country risked chaos. The collapse in oil prices was, for him, more than an economic crisis. It was a message from reality. Time for a revolution. From a business perspective, 2014 was a turning point. Many international firms that had counted on billion-dollar contracts suddenly had to withdraw as projects were frozen. Investors saw that Saudi Arabia was not as safe a market as they had imagined. But many of them also realized that if the kingdom decided to reform, an enormous potential would open, a new market for technology, services, education, and infrastructure. The oil crash was a paradox. On one hand, it exposed weaknesses. On the other, it created the conditions for something new. Without that crisis, there would be no Vision 2030. Without that crisis, no one would have dared say publicly that oil is not the future. It was the pain of deficits, the fear of collapse, and the recognition of fragile foundations that created the impulse for reform. That's how revolutions are born, not out of abundance, but out of scarcity. Saudi Arabia discovered that the barrel of oil that had been its crown for decades had also become its chain. The only way forward was to break that chain and forge a new identity. When the dust of the 2014 crisis settled and the red lines on charts stopped at painfully low levels, a decision was taken in Riyadh that would change the trajectory of the kingdom. Saudi Arabia could no longer live off a single barrel. It could not pretend that oil, however generous, would guarantee eternal safety. New pillars had to be built, economic, social, and political, strong enough to carry the weight of the 21st century. Vision 2030 became the signpost, but the real content of the transformation lay in specific sectors. Saudi Arabia needed to step outside its role as the world's petrol station and enter the game as an innovator, a technology provider, a tourism and culture hub, and a leader in energy transition. The first pillar was renewable energy. In a country where the sun shines almost constantly and winds along the Red Sea coast blow steadily through much of the year, the potential is obvious. The Saudis announced plans for huge solar and wind farms and projects tied to green hydrogen. The vision was clear. A nation that had supplied the world with fossil fuels for decades now wanted to supply the fuel of the future, clean energy. It was not just business but also a PR move, meant to show that a state long associated with emissions and oil addiction wanted to be part of the climate solution. The second pillar was technology and artificial intelligence. The Crown Prince understood that the future isn't only about energy, but about data. The state invested in data centers, AI platforms, and training programs for young engineers. Saudi Arabia invited major tech companies, offering contracts and tax breaks. At the same time, it backed startups that could test ideas in conditions no other market offered. On a desert where everything is being built from scratch, you can experiment without the legacy constraints of old cities. The third pillar was tourism and culture, a revolution that would have seemed unthinkable not long ago. In a country where tourism had been almost entirely limited to pilgrims visiting Mecca and Medina, the government suddenly began building luxury resorts, opening beaches and hotels, and even organizing music and film festivals. The leadership recognized that the world wants new destinations, and that Saudi Arabia, with its Red Sea coast, desert landscapes, and northern mountains, has a lot more to offer than religious sites alone. The goal was not only to attract foreign visitors, but also to change the mindset of young Saudis, showing them that life can include leisure industries, creativity, and hospitality. The fourth pillar was sport and entertainment. The kingdom started investing billions in major sports events, hosting boxing galas, Formula One races, signing global football stars. This was part of a larger plan to create an entertainment market that previously had not existed. Cinemas, banned for 35 years, reopened. Concerts, unimaginable a decade ago, became normal. For young people, this was a cultural revolution, giving them a sense that they belonged to a global youth culture rather than living in a parallel reality. The fifth pillar was biotechnology and healthcare. The Saudis knew they could not easily outcompete established Western players in saturated sectors, but they could carve out niches: modern clinics, genetic research, pharmaceutical production. Sovereign funds became bridges to attract top scientists and research firms. Each of these pillars was a brick in the new foundation of Saudi Arabia. Together, they were meant to carry the weight of the transformation. Each also raised questions. Would renewables really become a priority in a country that had thrived on oil? Would a society raised within conservative frameworks accept more open cultural and tourism policies? Would billions be enough to convince the world that the kingdom is not just a land of contrasts, but a truly modern center? From a business perspective, it was the opportunity of the century. For energy firms, contracts for solar and wind projects. For tech companies, entry into a new AI and data ecosystem. For tourism players, building resorts and hotels in a place that had been largely closed to outsiders. For entertainment, a young population hungry for global trends. For medicine, access to funding and a state ready to spend billions on scientific development. For society, it meant changes in everyday life. Older generations had to accept the end of some free benefits, but younger people dove into new sectors with enthusiasm. Female computer science students started dreaming of working on tech projects in NEOM. Young men wanted to be coaches, event organizers, tour guides. Aspirations shifted from, I want to work in a refinery, to, I want to be part of the global economy. These new economic pillars were not just an economic strategy, but also a social experiment. Saudi Arabia was trying to build not only new buildings and revenue streams, but also new dreams and new attitudes. Whether this experiment succeeds depends not just on billions of dollars, but on whether society accepts the new rules of the game. You can reset a foundation in a few years. You cannot change the mentality of a nation with a single decree. That was the true test of Vision 2030, whether the new pillars can bear the weight of the future.